The corpse in the cave. The wind howled through the narrow canyon, sending echoes that bounced off the jagged cliffs. Detective Linda Pierce tightened her scarf and glanced over her shoulder. Her partner, Detective Oscar Hale, trailed behind, his flashlight casting wild beams of light against the cave walls. They had been called out here at dawn after a hiker reported something strange inside a cave nestled deep in the wilderness. The dispatcher hadn't given many details, just that it involved a body. It was the kind of case that left an unsettling feeling in Linda's gut. As they approached the cave's entrance, the air grew colder. The scent of damp earth and mildew made Linda wrinkle her nose. "Ready?" Oscar asked, his voice low and tense. Linda nodded. "Let's do this." They stepped inside. Oh. The cave swallowed them whole. Shadows closed in, and the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The beam of Oscar's flashlight revealed slick rocks, dripping stalactites, and a floor scattered with debris. But the real focus was further in, where the beam fell upon a figure slumped against the cave wall. Linda's breath caught in her throat. It was a woman, mid-30s, maybe. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though she had just fallen asleep. But the pallor of her skin and the stiff way her body rested told a different story. "Any ID?" Oscar muttered, stepping closer. Linda crouched and gingerly searched the woman's pockets. Her fingers closed around a leather wallet. She flipped it open. "Claire Monroe," Linda read aloud. 34. "Why does that name sound familiar?" Oscar frowned. Before Linda could answer, a gust of wind rushed through the cave, making an eerie whistling sound. She shivered. "We need to call this in," she said. "And I want to know what Claire Monroe was doing out here." Oscar's jaw clenched. "I have a feeling we're going to regret asking that question." They left the cave after securing the scene, their thoughts heavy. The sun had climbed higher, but the chill remained. The town of Pine Ridge was only 20 minutes away, a small cluster of buildings nestled in the valley. They drove in silence, each lost in thought. At the station, Linda reviewed the information they had on Claire Monroe. It wasn't much. She had lived alone, worked as a freelance writer, and kept mostly to herself. "Something doesn't add up," Linda murmured, tapping her pen against her desk. "Why would she be out in the middle of nowhere in that cave?" Oscar looked up from his own notes. Maybe she was meeting someone, or hiding from someone. Before they could discuss it further, a knock on the door interrupted them. It was Officer Trent. "Detectives," Trent said, his face pale. "You need to see this." He handed Linda a manila envelope. Her heart thudded as she opened it. Inside were photographs. Grainy, black and white shots of Claire Monroe. In each photo, she was standing outside the cave, looking nervous. In one, she was glancing over her shoulder. In another, she was holding a folded piece of paper. "These were taken yesterday," Trent said, "by a wildlife camera near the cave." Linda's fingers tightened on the photos. She knew something, or someone was following her. Oscar's eyes narrowed. "We need to go back to that cave." "Oh. My." They arrived at the cave just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The world was bathed in twilight, and shadows grew long and sinister. Linda's instinct screamed that they were walking into a trap, but they had no choice. Inside the cave, the air was colder than before. They retraced their steps, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The spot where Claire's body had been was now marked off with police tape. But something was wrong. Linda froze. The tape was torn. The rocks around the scene were disturbed, as though someone had been there recently. "Someone's been here," Oscar whispered. A noise echoed from deeper within the cave. A soft scraping sound. Linda's pulse quickened. She exchanged a glance with Oscar. He nodded, and they moved forward slowly, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. The scraping sound grew louder. They rounded a corner, and froze. A figure stood hunched over a large open box. The man was gaunt, his hair wild and unkempt. He looked up, his eyes wide with panic. "Who are you?" Linda demanded. The man's mouth twisted into a snarl. "You shouldn't have come here." He lunged. Nice. Chaos erupted. Linda dodged to the side, barely avoiding the man's grasp. Oscar tackled him, and they crashed to the ground, struggling in the narrow space. The man fought like a cornered animal, his nails clawing at Oscar's face. "Get the cuffs," Oscar shouted. Linda fumbled for her handcuffs and snapped them around the man's wrists. He slumped, panting and defeated. "Who are you?" Linda asked again, her voice hard. The man laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You don't get it, do you? Try me." He lifted his head, eyes gleaming with something close to madness. "Claire wasn't the first, and she won't be the last." A chill ran down Linda's spine. Oscar stood up, wiping blood from his cheek. "What do you mean?" The man's smile widened. "There are more secrets in this cave than you could ever imagine." Back at the station, the pieces began to fall into place. The man, Jonathan Cross, had been living off the grid for years. He was obsessed with the cave, convinced it held something valuable. Claire had stumbled onto his secret, and he had killed her to keep it safe. But the question remained, what was in the cave? Linda stared at the evidence board, her mind racing. They had a killer in custody, but the mystery wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Deal. Keto be continued.
The sweet taste of evidence. The small town of Millstone was known for its peaceful streets, charming cafes, and annual baking competitions. This year's event promised to be no different, with locals eagerly preparing their most delectable desserts to impress the judges. However, as Detective Linda Hartwell and her partner, Detective Oscar Blake, would soon discover, there was something far more sinister than flour and sugar at play. Chapter 1. A Deadly Dessert. Linda strolled into the Millstone Baking Hall, the air thick with the smell of freshly baked pastries. She adjusted her leather jacket and surveyed the room. The annual baking contest was one of the town's biggest events, drawing participants from all over the county. The excitement was palpable, until it wasn't. A scream pierced the chatter of the crowd. Linda's sharp eyes darted to the source. Near a table laden with cakes and pies, a young woman had collapsed, clutching her throat. Her face was turning an alarming shade of blue. Oscar, who had been sampling a cupcake, was by the woman's side in an instant. "She's not breathing," he said, his voice steady but urgent. Linda grabbed a chair and gently lowered the woman onto her back. "Call an ambulance," she shouted to no one in particular. Despite their best efforts, the woman, identified as Emily Harper, one of the baking contestants, died before paramedics arrived. The doctors later confirmed it: cyanide poisoning. Chapter 2. A Bitter Clue. The cyanide had been traced to one of Emily's tarts, a miniature raspberry pie that had already been submitted to the judges. Linda and Oscar stood in the contest's makeshift kitchen, examining the remaining desserts. Who would poison their own dish? Linda asked, her brow furrowed. Oscar crouched near the counter, inspecting a faint dusting of powder. "Not their own. Someone tampered with it," he said, rising to meet her gaze. The contest had become a crime scene, and every contestant was now a suspect. Chapter 3. Suspects and Motives. The contestants were gathered in a small room, adjacent to the hall. Linda scanned their faces. Fear, anger, and suspicion were written across them. Margaret Turner, the reigning champion, had a reputation for being fiercely competitive. Was it jealousy? Peter Collins, a local pastry chef, had been arguing with Emily earlier in the day. What was it about? Leila Monroe, Emily's best friend, looked devastated but avoided eye contact. Was she hiding something? Richard Gale, a wealthy newcomer to town, seemed unbothered by the chaos. Why such indifference? As Linda questioned them, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lying. Chapter 4. The Sweet Alibi. Margaret denied any involvement, claiming she was too busy perfecting her soufflé to even glance at Emily's dish. Peter admitted to the argument, but said it was over a misunderstanding about borrowed ingredients. Leela insisted she had no reason to harm Emily, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise. Richard claimed he barely knew Emily and was only participating for fun. But when Linda and Oscar checked their alibis, cracks began to form. Margaret's timeline didn't match up. Peter had been seen near Emily's table shortly before her collapse. And Richard? He had been spotted whispering to one of the judges, a connection that raised more questions than answers. Chapter 5. The Missing Ingredient. The breakthrough came when Oscar discovered an empty vial in the trash near the kitchen. It tested positive for cyanide. Linda stared at the evidence bag, her mind racing. Whoever did this planned it carefully. They wanted Emily dead. Or they wanted to sabotage her chances of winning, Oscar added. The poison might have been meant to ruin her dessert, not kill her. This theory opened a new line of inquiry. Linda reviewed the contest rules. Any dish deemed inedible would be disqualified. Could jealousy have driven someone to take such a risk? Chapter 6. A Tangled Web. A closer look at Emily's personal life revealed more secrets. She had been in a bitter dispute with her landlord, none other than Richard Gale, over unpaid rent. Witnesses also claimed that Margaret had accused Emily of stealing her secret recipe last year. Linda and Oscar pieced together the timeline, and one name kept resurfacing, Lila. Emily's supposed best friend had access to her kitchen, knew her schedule, and had everything to gain if Emily were eliminated. But the detectives needed more than suspicion. They needed proof. Chapter 7. The Trap is Set. Linda devised a plan. The following day, she announced that Emily's raspberry tart would undergo further testing to determine the exact source of the poison. She made sure the suspects overheard. That night, Linda and Oscar hid in the kitchen, cameras recording every angle. Around midnight, a figure crept into the room. It was Lila. Lila opened a small jar and began sprinkling powder onto the tart. Before she could escape, Linda flipped on the lights. Going somewhere. Chapter 8. The Bitter Truth. In the interrogation room, Lila broke down. I didn't mean to hurt her, she sobbed. I just wanted to ruin her chances. She always took everything. My ideas, my friends. This was supposed to be my year. Linda's voice was calm but firm. You didn't just ruin her chances, Lila. You took her life. The cyanide, it turned out, had been left over from an old pest control kit in Lila's garage. She had underestimated its potency, thinking it would only make Emily's tart taste bitter. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The case shook the small town to its core. Leela was charged with manslaughter, and the baking contest was cancelled indefinitely. As Linda and Oscar walked out of the precinct, the weight of the case hung heavy in the air. Do you think justice was served? Oscar asked. Linda sighed. Justice is never sweet, Oscar, but it's necessary. The two detectives got into their car, ready for the next mystery. After all, in Millstone, secrets were always waiting to be uncovered.
The cryptic text: A Detective Brennan and Booth mystery. The sound of her phone vibrating against the wooden desk startled Detective Brennan out of her focus. She had been poring over an old case file, searching for overlooked connections. The vibration wasn't unusual, her line of work demanded constant connectivity. But the moment she picked up the phone, she knew this was no ordinary notification. Help me. I'm trapped. Time is running out. Coordinates: 40.7128 degrees north, 74.0060 degrees west. Her sharp instincts kicked in. The message had no name, no sender information, and yet it was chilling in its urgency. The coordinates pointed to a spot near the docks in Manhattan. Brennan's mind raced. Was it a prank? A trap? Or a genuine plea for help? She quickly called her partner, Detective Booth. "Booth," she said, her voice steady but urgent, "I've got a lead, possibly a crime in progress. Meet me at the docks." Chapter 1: Shadows at the Docks. The docks were eerily quiet when Brennan arrived. The salty scent of the Hudson River mixed with the faint metallic tang of rust. Booth arrived moments later, his tall frame silhouetted against the orange glow of the streetlights. "Got the message," he said, holding up his phone. The same cryptic text had reached him too. "This is odd, even for us." Brennan nodded. "Whoever sent it, they knew how to get our attention. Let's start looking." Their search led them to an abandoned warehouse near the edge of the water. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and damp. Dust motes floated in the beams of their flashlights as they moved cautiously, their weapons drawn. "Over here," Booth called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He had found a small envelope taped to a rusted pillar. Inside was a photograph of a young woman, her face pale with fear, and another note, "You're too late. The clock is ticking." Brennan's pulse quickened. "They're toying with us." Chapter 2: The Puzzle Unfolds. The duo returned to the precinct, their minds racing with questions. Who was the woman in the photo? Why were they chosen to receive the message? Booth placed the photo on the evidence board while Brennan analyzed the note for clues. "It's typed, no fingerprints," Brennan muttered. "But the paper, high-quality linen. Not something you'd find at a corner store." Booth stared at the photo. "Her eyes, she looks terrified. Whoever did this is playing a game, and they want us to follow." Their first lead came when Brennan matched the photo to a missing persons report filed 3 days ago. The woman's name was Emily Carter, a 25-year-old journalist investigating organized crime in the city. Her last known location? Near the same docks. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a series of encrypted emails on Emily's laptop. The emails hinted at a shadowy figure known only as the puppeteer, a mastermind rumored to manipulate events from the shadows, pulling strings to orchestrate chaos. Chapter 3: The Chase Begins. The next morning, another text arrived, "She's still alive. For now. Follow the trail if you dare." Attached were coordinates leading to an upscale hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Brennan and Booth wasted no time. At the hotel, they discovered a room booked under a false name. Inside, a laptop sat on the desk, its screen displaying a live feed of Emily, bound and gagged in a dimly lit room. A countdown timer ticked ominously in the corner, 12 hours. "She's alive," Booth said, his jaw tightening. "But where is she?" Brennan examined the room, searching for clues. The laptop's IP address traced back to a local server farm. "It's a diversion," she concluded. "They want to lead us astray." Chapter 4: A Web of Deception. As the hours passed, Brennan and Booth followed lead after lead, each one more cryptic than the last. They found themselves piecing together fragments of a larger puzzle, a network of interconnected crimes, all pointing back to the puppeteer. The turning point came when they discovered a hidden flash drive in Emily's apartment. On it was a file labeled Operation Marionette. It detailed plans to dismantle a rival crime syndicate using a mix of blackmail, abductions, and strategically placed informants. "Emily must have gotten too close," Booth said grimly. "And now they're using her as bait." Chapter 5: The Final Countdown. With only 2 hours left on the timer, Brennan and Booth received a final message, "Endgame. Come alone. 40.6892 degrees north, 74.0445 degrees west." The coordinates pointed to Liberty Island. As they approached the island, a storm began to brew, lightning illuminating the Statue of Liberty in flashes. In the island's shadow, they found an underground maintenance tunnel. Inside, they came face to face with the puppeteer, a cold, calculating man with piercing eyes and a voice that dripped with menace. "Welcome, detectives," he said, gesturing to Emily, who was tied to a chair. "You've done well to get this far. But the game isn't over." Brennan stepped forward. Let her go. This ends now. The puppeteer smirked. Ah, but endings are so final. Let's make this more interesting. He pressed a button, and the room began to fill with water. Booth rushed to untie Emily while Brennan tackled the puppeteer. The struggle was fierce, but Brennan's determination won out. She managed to handcuff him just as Booth freed Emily. Chapter 6, Justice Served. Back at the precinct, the puppeteer sat in an interrogation room, his expression unreadable. Emily was safe, though shaken, and her testimony would bring down the criminal empire the puppeteer had built. You did good out there, Booth said, handing Brennan a cup of coffee. We make a hell of a team. Brennan allowed herself a small smile. We always do. As they filed away the case, another text came through. This one was different, though, simple, almost taunting. You won this time. But the game is far from over. Brennan and Booth exchanged a look. The puppeteer might be behind bars, but his influence lingered. They knew their fight wasn't over. For now, though, they had won. The end.